All right, thanks, Eric. Give me one quick second. Tonight, Lord willing, I want to take a look at some verses. This is not a new study. Um, I've offered these verses before, but I wanted to go back and summarize it even further and try to concentrate more on the spiritual side of this study here. The days are shortened. All right, the days are shortened. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. Gregory, hi, welcome. Just getting started. I'd like to share some verses tonight on the days are shortened. And here's the heading. Those days. What are we talking about when we look at those days? What do you suppose is in view? Well, it is the tribulation, isn't it? Those days. What other ways does God use to identify the days of the tribulation? Can anyone tell me? Any thoughts? Other than those days? What else do we read in the Bible? Those days, that time, in those days, in that day. All of these are synonyms, I believe, for the Great Tribulation. Now, the verse that I want to focus on, Matthew 24 and verse 22. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And we read the same thing in Mark chapter 13 and verse 20. And except the Lord had shortened those days. Now, is this, we're going to look at, I'm going to offer the calendar aspect of this, because in the past I used to look at this verse purely as relating to the timeline of history, and that's what brings us to 1988 and 1994. And I think the Bible does have something to say about that. But more importantly today, I think we're looking at how these verses relate spiritually to the church, right? Isn't that what's in view here? So except that the Lord had shortened those days, except the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh should be saved. Now, Matthew 24, verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation. That's those days, isn't it? The days of the tribulation. Such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. You guys can hear me, right? I know Eric is able to hear me. Just making sure that we're still online here. Okay, good. So, for then shall be great tribulation. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7. Alas, for that day is great. That day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble. You see how many different ways God can refer to the same period of time? Jacob's trouble, that's those days, isn't it? That day, great tribulation. So that's what's in view here again, I believe. Jeremiah chapter 33 and verse 15. In those days and at that time. Now notice the salvation verse right after that. Will I cause a branch of righteousness to grow up unto David? So we're looking at, you see the gospel there? You see judgment coming on the body. That's those days. That's Jacob's trouble. The days of the tribulation. And then we see the language of salvation, a time when God is going to bring back the captivity of his people. We see that in Joel 3 verse 1. For behold, in those days and at that time when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. And it's the same period in view here, I believe, in Revelation 9 and verse 6. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. What death are they looking for here? Yes, amen, Eric. Great tribulation, Jacob's trouble, those days, that time, these days. I don't think the Bible uses these days. I'd have to double check, but yeah, certainly those days of the tribulation. Now keep in mind that those days, I want to offer that this is talking about, it's talking about the tribulation, but it also transitions into the revelation of Christ. Very important, I think. So those days equals tribulation, okay, where judgment begins at the house of God, but then it transitions into the day of judgment. Can anyone explain that to me in your own words? Just to make sure that we're understanding that aspect of it. So it's very important because God is not separating the tribulation from the revelation of Christ. Does that make sense? And that's why I think we read in Matthew 24, I believe, immediately or with the tribulation of those days. Not after the tribulation, but with the tribulation of those days, we read. I forget exactly the verse, but in Matthew 24, I believe. And then in there's a similar passage, I think in the book of Mark, where God speaks of, yes, with the tribulation of those days. And then the other side of it is, I forget the exact reference. But what's important there, I think, is the fact that God is speaking of the same time period. It's the day of the Lord. It begins with Christ coming in the form of the locusts, the thieves. So that's the day of the Lord. It is judgment day. It is the great tribulation. It is Jacob's trouble. But then at the same time, God transitions. When this tribulation was cut short, God transitions right into the revelation of Christ. So we have to look at the context to see whether God is talking about tribulation or post-tribulation. And okay, so that's the day that we're looking at. These days, or I'm sorry, those days of that time, Jacob's trouble, the days of the great tribulation. Now, we also see some verses, and I offered some of these verses earlier. Days of youth. And I think you'll see there a beautiful connection, Lord willing, how God is tying in the great tribulation to the days of youth. And the picture we get there is a young man, full of life, vibrant, full of days, and enjoying life. Well, we know that God speaks in parables, so we have to see how this is relating to the church. And then we see a connection between this parable and the church coming into the great tribulation. This is a time when the church is rejoicing. It does not remember God. It is like a young man full of life, full of days, not really worried about what happens later on, right? Isn't that interesting? So that's the picture, the parabolic picture I think we see here. So in Psalm 89 verse 45, the days of his youth has thou shortened. You see the connection there? God is shortening the days. And that, I propose, is the language of judgment. Right? And that's what we saw there in Matthew 24:22, except those days should be shortened. So God is shortening the days of the church, the days of Babylon, which is known or called the days of youth. He weakened, Psalm 102:23, he weakened my strength in the way he shortened my days. Now, another thing I think is worth pointing out. The believers also, do you suppose that they were subject to this time? Were they subject to God shortening their days? Because I think Psalm 102 there is messianic in nature, if I'm not mistaken. We see a lot of verses in the Bible where the believers are calling on the name of the Lord. How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge? And then we read that God judges the elect. When we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord. So yeah, the believers, they too came into this time of tribulation, and therefore they would have been a part of this judgment, that God shortened the days. But we know from the rest of the Bible, because we have to compare that to the rest of the Bible, for the elect, it is that they are going through the fire. God does not forsake them in the sense that they are redeemed. God brings back their captivity. Excuse me. Proverbs 10:27. The fear of the Lord prolongeth days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. So the years of the wicked are shortened. The days of the wicked, those are cut short. Ecclesiastes 11 verse 9. And that's what I mentioned earlier, the picture that we see here. Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth. Let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth. Walk in the ways of thine heart. Isn't that what the church did in tribulation? To me, it's just absolutely amazing. The wisdom of God, the way that the Bible is written in such parabolic format, but then when we see the gospel there, we see how it relates spiritually to the kingdom, right? Walk in the ways of thine heart and in the sight of thine eyes, but know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. So because the church went apostate, God now brings judgment on Babylon. So again, it was typified by a young man enjoying life. Job 36 verse 14, they die in youth. So that's the judgment that comes on the church. The days of the wicked are cut short. So they die in youth. They die while they are young. Whereas the believers, their days are said to be what? On the spiritual side, what happens to the believers? What about their days? I posted a verse just now. The fear of the Lord prolongeth days. So their days are prolonged. Their days are not cut short in the sense that they are redeemed. God brings back their captivity. So they die in youth. Ecclesiastes 11 verse 10. Therefore remove sorrow from thy heart and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. Childhood and youth are vanity. Does anyone not see the tie-in there between days of youth and the Great Tribulation? Ezekiel 23 verse 3, and they committed whoredoms. Now God, I think, is getting to be a little more specific here and going back to the church. They committed whoredoms in their youth. Ezekiel 23 verse 19, yet she multiplied her whoredoms and calling to remembrance the days of her youth, wherein she had played the harlot in the land of Egypt. So you see that it is in the days of youth that the church commits fornication, whoredoms. Babylon is fallen, or Babylon falls at the revelation of Christ. But the days of youth is a time when the church is unclean. Ezekiel 16 verse 22, and in all thine abominations and thy whoredoms thou hast not remembered the days of thy youth. What does this remind us of? thou hast not remembered the days of thy youth. Take a look at this verse here, Ecclesiastes 12 verse 1. Here's the command that God gave to the body. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. When is the church saying this? I have no pleasure in them. Is this a language of judgment or salvation? I've heard some people say, well, this is talking about the believers not having pleasure in the days after May 21. Is that what this is teaching? Not having pleasure, in other words, they're being mocked and ridiculed. They're being tested, so they have no pleasure. No. Well, that's the way that they're going to interpret it if they're looking at it carnally, if they're not looking at it spiritually. Because pleasure, who is pleasure in the Bible? Pleasure is Christ. Pleasure is Christ. So for someone to say, I have no pleasure, that's the language of judgment. In other words, they're saying they do not have Christ. So can you see the irony there? A lot of people, they read some of these verses casually. They're not comparing spiritual. They're not relating it to the whole Bible. And they're not seeing, Lord willing, again, spiritually, how these verses relate to the church. And so they try to relate them to what they are physically enduring or physically going through because of this action and that action. And I propose there again that that's not spiritual. It's not the gospel. So the days draw nigh when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. So in other words, when Christ is revealed, now today or at the time, the church in the days of thy youth, that's the Great Tribulation. Remember, let's see, this verse I just posted, where is it? Ecclesiastes 11:9. Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth. Let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart. So that's the church and tribulation. And God is here, God is saying here, remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not. And that would have to be the time when Christ is revealed to separate the wheat from the tares, because at that point the door is shut and God now is judging Babylon and then at the same time redeeming the elect. So remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. And then Jeremiah 17 verse 11. As the partridge sitteth on eggs and hatcheth them not, so he that getteth the riches. What does that remind us of? What comes to mind when you see something like he that getteth riches, and not by right, shall leave them in the midst of his days? Eric, can you hear me? It seems like you might be having a little problem with Power Talk. So those who get riches, the rich man, right? The rich man. Yeah, false gospel. That's the rich man. And that's why we read here, I believe, and not by right. So they're not rich towards God. They're rich in their own eyes. They're rich in their false gospels, their doctrines, and so on. So they have their own Christ. They provide a false assurance of salvation. The rich man, Babylon, yes. And then it says here, shall leave them in the midst of his days. You see the beautiful tie-in there? That's the days of youth. In other words, this is a young man, a young person who is not getting to enjoy the fullness of life. His days are cut short. So that's the church. Again, I believe, right? That's the church. And that's the tie-in there I think we see with those days being shortened. The days of the wicked are shortened. Okay, any questions so far? Any questions there? We're looking at except those days should be shortened, And I think there's a great deal of information to see how there's a beautiful spiritual tie in there. But another thing that came to mind, and I'll go back to the to that verse here again. Let me post the other heading. For the elect's sake. We want to take a look at that phrase. Is salvation now dependent on judgments first coming on the church? And what I mean by that is that, there appears to be language in the Bible where it's almost as if God is saying there can't be salvation without judgment. Does that make sense? It is the fact that judgment comes on the body, so there's a sacrifice, and that seems to make sense because that's what happened to Christ. He had to be judged as the Lamb of God. He had to be slain, and because of this judgment, God was able to provide. That's like, Moses also smiting the rock. And that spiritual language, I propose, it is judgment coming on Christ, and because of that judgment, salvation was made possible. So that's what I'm going to try to offer here, and not going to spend too much time on it. So if you have anything you want to share or some feedback, I'd be happy to look at it. Except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake. What does that mean? For the sake of the elect. Well, we know that the tribulation, God hides his face from the body, including the believers. And now those days, in other words, God is going to bring judgment to Babylon. God appears to be saying here on the spiritual side that except those days should be shortened, except judgment came on the body, then there would not be redemption. Does that make sense? I mean, think about that. And that seems to be in line with other verses, as I mentioned, in the Bible. Psalm 102, verses 23 and 24, which I added an extra 23 there. Oh, yeah, so don't disregard that. He weakened my strength in the way, he shortened my days. Notice here, I said, oh my God, take me not away in the midst of my days. So that's the prayer for salvation. In other words, do not allow me, a believer, to come into the second death. Take me not away in the midst of my days. So this tells me that the shortening of the days already began in tribulation. That's where the judgment was. You see that? So the elect, they had to be exposed. They had to endure that judgment, the shortening of the days. And that's why I think we read there, except those days should be shortened, except God now would bring judgment on Babylon, then the elect would not be coming out of tribulation. And this seems to tie into the other references that we read where judgment begins at the house of God. 1 Peter 4:17 means judgment starts with the church, and without judgment there is no redemption. There's another verse that just came to mind. Without the shedding of blood. Remember that verse? I don't have it here, but I think it might apply. Without the shedding of blood. Hebrews 9 verse 22. And almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission. That, I think, also summarizes what I'm offering here. Can you see that? So there has to be a sacrifice. There has to be a judgment. And with this judgment, the elect are able to experience salvation. That, to me, I think is interesting. And I want to incorporate that verse into the study. I'll do that a little bit later on tonight. Hey, Green Eyes, welcome. So, Hebrews 9:22, almost all things are by the law purged with blood. We're looking at the days are shortened, and I'm offering the spiritual side of it, which has to do with God cutting short the days of the wicked, the days of his youth. which had to do with the church coming into the Great Tribulation. Jeremiah 25 verse 29, for lo, I begin to bring evil on the city which is called by my name, and should ye be utterly unpunished. So that's what I'm offering here. 1 Peter 4:17, judgment begins at the house of God. God begins to bring evil on the city called by his name. It all seems to relate to the fact that there is a sacrifice, there is a judgment that has to come on the church, where God is shortening the days of the wicked, of the body. Now because of this, for the sake of the elect, for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So the believers, the reason that they're coming out of Babylon is because God has also decided to judge the unsaved in the body. Okay, Matthew 13 verse 30, let both grow together until the harvest, and at the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, gather ye first the tares and bind them in bundles. So you notice how the tares are being gathered first. The tares are gathered. So there again, I think there might be an implication there that God is concerned with judgment coming on the church, and with this judgment, with this trial that is coming on the body, God is able to provide redemption. Okay, now, any questions on that? This was I was offering some verses related to the spiritual nature, the spiritual side of the days that are shortened. Hold on one second, I'll be right back. Don't hang up. Okay, sorry about that. Alright, sorry about that. Okay, so, any questions? The days are shortened on the spiritual side, has a lot to do with the church coming into the Great Tribulation. Now, what about the way that we, in the past, we've understood these verses? I want to, I'm not going to spend too much time on the calendar, but I do want to say that the Bible also offers a lot of information that seem to relate the shortening of the days from the 23 years to the 2300 days. So let's go back to Matthew 24:22. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Now that's how Family Radio, I think, understood this verse. Mr. Camping, which is why he came up with 1994. Remember that? Now, is there any merit to it? I believe there is. And we have to be honest about that. And the reason I say that is because the way that I see the numbers spiritually relating to the revelation of Christ. And I think there's a lot of information that where 1994 becomes a very big year in terms of the developments of the activities related to the end. And that's about where I want to leave it right now, because we understand that once Christ is revealed, then God is no longer officially on the calendar. Does that make sense? That, I think, it's very important, Lord willing. The vision is yet for an appointed time, but in the end, well, Christ is the judge. He is the Word of God. So he relates altogether with, he is the very essence of the numbers, the calendar, the Bible, the Word of God. So therefore, if Christ is revealed, that's why today I believe we can't find any substance in the calendar. But nonetheless, when we talk about the development or the outline of the timeline of history, the way that developed, I do think there is some information we can learn from that as well. So we see here Daniel 8 chapter 8 verse 13. Then I heard one saint speaking. Bible teacher, hi, welcome. And another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision? What vision? What vision? How long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both a sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? Now, can anyone tell me, is this significant? Is that relevant? Do you think that God is focusing here on a passage of time? We read in the next verse, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, is this talking about 2,300 literal days? Well, I think it's relevant simply because we see the pattern, the outlining of the timeline of history. So we don't want to set that aside. We want to be very candid. We want to look at everything the Bible has to offer. We want to look at the numbers. We want to look at the calendar, if there is a calendar. Yeah, okay, no problem. Yeah, that's what I thought you meant, Eric. We want to look at the calendar. We want to see how this calendar relates. Does it come from the Bible? Yes. But how do we understand the calendar? Do we try to develop our own doctrine and then staple it to the back of the calendar? No. We want to see, just like everything else, how the calendar is related to the rest of the Bible. Okay, no problem. Almost done here. Okay. And like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and I'm going to give you the reference here. There is a study where I offered some information there on the 2,300 days, the 1,200 days, and so on. In Daniel 12 verse 11, and from the time that the daily sacrifice or the daily shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now that number, I believe it is symbolic. It's not a literal 1,200 days, but when we look at the overall timeline, the overall calendar, we do see how spiritually it ties into 1994. Everything else, as far as I can see, all the numbers in the Bible, as we look at them spiritually, as they relate to the timing of judgment, God's judgment on Babylon, God, it seems, has a lot to say about the revelation of Christ. But as I said before, today, well, they're all spiritual, that's true. But what I'm saying is, if we understand that judgment is on Babylon today, then we have to factor in how those numbers developed into the point. Now, we would not have seen that. Now, it's true that Mr. Camping, before 1994, he saw that 1994 was a significant year because of the way the calendar unfolded. But Mr. Camping did not understand what 1994 was about, because he was looking for a physical manifestation of Christ. And even today, even after that time, I think many people, for the most part, a great deal of people, they would not understand the spiritual side of that period. And the reason being, again, I propose, is that if Christ is revealed, well, he had to be revealed in accordance with the timing that God has set forth in the Bible. And whether we want to, accept that or not, that I propose, again, Lord willing, it is a fact, if we are going to be open to everything the Bible has to offer. Now, today, many people, they look at the date, they look at the calendar, they try to extend it. Oh, just because it fits some other things, but it doesn't fit the doctrine. So that now, if we try to extend the calendar, we're looking at numbers, and then we're coming up with our own doctrines as to how these numbers are going to play out, or that date is going to reveal Christ. Well, then we miss the mark. We miss the spiritual. because Christ is already revealed, and so therefore there is no more substance in that calendar. So the study, for those interested, 1290 verses, 1335 days. So there's some information there perhaps that might expand on what I'm offering here just a little bit, just to show that we don't want to set aside how these numbers develop historically. All right, and my conclusion, and we'll talk some more about that in a few minutes. So let's just summarize on the Bible study. On the spiritual side, the Bible appears to be associating the shortening of the days to judgment on the church taking place after the tribulation. After the tribulation. Those days were described as a young man rejoicing in his days of youth, and that spiritually pointed to the church rejoicing at the killing of the body of Christ in tribulation. Those days began with the elect enduring tribulation, and that transition to the total devastation, that is the death of the body at the revelation of Christ. Now I think today especially there is more meat, there is more substance, and the days that are shortened, when we look at them, when we see how they relate to God's judgment on Babylon, just like anything else. Just like anything else. That's where the substance is, so truth is always going to be found there. The other aspect of it that I was offering is that when we look at how the numbers develop, it seems that God, in fact, He did reveal a time for the revelation of Christ, but after that time, now we set the calendar aside, we set the timeline aside because there's no more substance there. All right, let me turn off the recorder for now, and then we can open for discussion.